The morning bell rang loudly through the halls of Brookside High School, echoing against the lockers and carrying into every corner of the building. Students hurried to their classrooms, chatting about weekend plans, sports games, and silly gossip. In the middle of all this noise, a boy named Daniel walked slowly, carrying his worn-out backpack close to his chest. His steps were quiet, almost careful, as if he did not want to disturb anyone. He had become good at blending into the background. Daniel was 16, but unlike most of the students in his grade, he had been held back a year. This meant many of his classmates were younger than him, and that fact alone gave them an endless reason to tease him. To them, being held back meant failure, and in the cruel world of high school, it was a label that stuck. Daniel heard whispers in the hallways, words like slow, dumb, and lazy. None of those words were true, but he rarely defended himself. Instead, he stayed silent, preferring not to draw attention. His classroom was at the end of the corridor, room 204, where the strictest math teacher in the school, Mr. Carter, taught. Mr. Carter was a man in his late 40s with a reputation for being sharp-tongued and sarcastic. He had little patience for mistakes, and he had a habit of turning students into examples whenever he wanted to make a point. Some students feared him, others laughed nervously when he scolded someone. Daniel, unfortunately, had become one of his easiest targets. As Daniel entered the classroom, he kept his head down and slipped into his seat at the very back. The desks were arranged neatly in rows, the whiteboard was already covered with complex numbers from an earlier class, and the teacher's chair sat angled just so, like a throne. Daniel opened his notebook, flipping to a page filled with his own scribbles and problems he had solved the night before. Numbers and patterns always danced in his mind. He saw connections where others saw confusion. But no one knew this secret. To everyone else, he was just the boy who had failed to keep up. The bell rang again, and silence fell as Mr. Carter entered the room, carrying his folder of papers. He scanned the class with sharp eyes and gave a short nod. The lesson began quickly, with the teacher writing equations on the board, his chalk moving fast as he explained. Students scrambled to keep up, copying notes, some struggling to understand. Daniel, however, followed easily. The numbers felt like an old language he already knew, and each step of the equation unfolded clearly in his head. He wrote neatly in his notebook, but he never raised his hand. Throughout the lesson, Mr. Carter's eyes occasionally darted to the back of the room where Daniel sat. He always seemed to enjoy pointing him out. At one point, when a student in the front row made a mistake, Mr. Carter smirked and said, "At least you're not Daniel. Imagine being in your shoes." The class erupted in laughter, and Daniel stared down at his desk, pretending not to hear. Despite the laughter, Daniel's mind wandered elsewhere. He thought about the library, where he spent hours reading books on advanced mathematics, puzzles, and even college-level theories. He loved solving problems no one asked him to solve. It gave him a sense of joy that nothing else did. Numbers did not laugh at him. Equations did not mock him. They simply waited for him to unlock their secrets. He had learned to keep this passion hidden because he knew that if people saw it, they might laugh even more. The day dragged on, but Daniel's patience was steady. He was used to the rhythm of being invisible, of surviving without drawing attention. Yet inside, he was not the failure everyone assumed he was. He was a thinker, a quiet genius, waiting for the world to notice. After class, a group of boys from the soccer team passed him in the hallway. One of them, tall and loud, nudged his friend and said loudly enough for Daniel to hear, "Hey, don't end up like him. Study or you'll get stuck like Daniel." They all laughed, and Daniel clenched his fists inside his pockets but kept walking. He never gave them the satisfaction of reacting. But deep down, he wished he could prove them wrong, not just the students, but also the teachers who thought little of him. Later that evening, when Daniel returned home, the house was quiet. His mother worked double shifts, and his father had left years ago. He often made his own dinner, sat at the small kitchen table, and opened his books. The world outside might think of him as someone who could not keep up, but inside his little room, surrounded by stacks of papers and pencils, he became alive. He solved problems one after another, filling notebooks with equations, theories, and sometimes even creating puzzles of his own. One night, he stared at a particularly complex equation he had found in a borrowed college book. It was supposed to take hours to solve, but to him, the path unfolded almost instantly. His pencil moved across the page, his handwriting quick yet precise, until the final answer appeared. He leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at his lips. If anyone could see him now, they would never call him slow again. But he knew no one would believe it unless he showed them, and he wasn't sure if he was ready. Back at school the next day, things felt the same. The students laughed, the teachers talked, and Daniel stayed silent. But something inside him was beginning to shift. He was tired of being invisible. Tired of letting others write his story for him. Deep down, he wanted the chance to prove himself, even if it meant stepping out of the shadows. Mr. Carter, on the other hand, was in no mood for patience that morning. He wanted to teach his students a lesson about hard work, about not being careless with their studies. And as fate would have it, his eyes landed on Daniel again. The boy sitting quietly at the back seemed the perfect example for another round of mockery. The teacher decided he would call him out in front of everyone soon. Daniel did not know that his moment of truth was approaching. For years, he had hidden his brilliance, afraid of laughter and rejection. But soon, the world inside that classroom would see him differently. Very soon, the boy they thought of as a failure would reveal a gift no one expected. The following day, the math class started like any other. The students shuffled into the room with their usual chatter, placing their books on the desks, laughing about small jokes only they understood. Daniel walked in quietly as always, moving straight to his seat at the back without looking at anyone. He had learned that eye contact often invited comments he did not want to hear. He settled into his chair, pulling out his notebook and pencil, ready to disappear into the background once again. Mr. Carter entered a few minutes later with his folder under one arm and a piece of chalk already in his hand. His sharp shoes clicked against the floor as he walked toward the board. He didn't greet the class in any warm manner. Instead, he cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to write. The lesson was on solving simultaneous equations. The chalk squeaked as he filled the board with large expressions, moving quickly, his back turned to the students. "Pay attention," he said in his usual stern voice. "These are the kind of problems that will decide whether you move forward or stay behind." His words carried an extra sting for Daniel, though the teacher did not mention his name. The boy lowered his eyes to his notebook, his pencil resting on the page as he copied carefully. As the lesson went on, a student in the front row raised her hand and asked a question. Mr. Carter explained, but when she made a small mistake in her calculations, he frowned. "You don't want to end up making silly errors like Daniel in the back row, do you?" he said with a smirk. The whole class turned toward the boy, some students chuckling. Daniel kept his eyes on his notebook, his heart thudding faster, but he did not respond. He had heard such remarks before. The students returned their attention to the board, but Mr. Carter wasn't done. He had a plan forming in his mind. For years, he had used sarcasm and mockery as tools to push students harder. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it only embarrassed them. But with Daniel, it became a habit. In his mind, Daniel represented what could happen if one didn't take studies seriously. What better way to prove his point than to call him out again, this time with something so complex that failure would be guaranteed? As the lesson neared its midpoint, Mr. Carter paused dramatically and turned back to the class. He tapped the chalk against the board, then wrote down a huge, complicated equation that stretched across the surface. The numbers and symbols looked intimidating, the kind of problem usually reserved for advanced competitions. Whispers filled the room as students stared wide-eyed at the board. This, the teacher said, stepping back to admire his own writing, is an equation none of you are expected to solve today. It's far beyond your level. But maybe, he paused, his eyes narrowing toward the back row, maybe someone here can give us a demonstration. The room went quiet for a moment. Then, almost on cue, several heads turned toward Daniel. Some students already started giggling, sensing where this was going. Daniel felt a wave of heat spread across his face. He knew what was about to happen, but he sat frozen, hoping it would not. "Daniel," Mr. Carter said firmly, his voice carrying across the room. "Why don't you come up and try this one? Let's see what you've got." The class erupted in laughter. A boy in the middle row whispered loudly, "This will be good." Another snorted, covering his mouth to hide his laughter. Daniel's heart sank. He wanted to stay invisible, not stand in front of the whole class. But Mr. Carter's tone left no room for refusal. Slowly, Daniel pushed back his chair and stood up. His legs felt heavy, but he forced himself to walk toward the board. The room seemed to grow quieter as he approached, though muffled chuckles still floated around. He could feel every eye on him, waiting for him to fail. When he reached the board, he stared at the equation for a few seconds. His chest rose and fell as he took a deep breath. To the rest of the class, it looked like he was frozen in confusion. But inside his mind, something else was happening. The numbers began to fall into place. Patterns appeared like puzzle pieces fitting together. While the others saw only chaos, he saw steps leading to a clear solution. Mr. Carter crossed his arms, clearly expecting the boy to fumble. "Go ahead, Daniel," he said with a mocking smile. "Don't keep us waiting." The class grew restless, whispering among themselves. Some students leaned forward in their seats, eager to watch the disaster unfold. But Daniel surprised them. With steady hands, he picked up the chalk and wrote the first step. His handwriting was neat, precise, and quick. Then he wrote another line, then another. At first, the class didn't understand what he was doing. But as the board filled with logical steps, the room grew quieter. The whispers stopped, replaced by curious silence. Daniel worked faster now, his mind clear and confident. To him, it felt like breathing natural, effortless. Minutes passed. By the time he neared the final steps, the room was completely silent. Even the students who had laughed the loudest earlier now sat frozen, eyes wide, following his every move. Mr. Carter's smirk had disappeared. He leaned slightly forward, his brows furrowed, watching carefully as if unable to believe what he was seeing. Finally, Daniel placed the last number on the board and circled the answer. He put the chalk down gently, then stepped aside. His chest rose and fell quickly, not from difficulty, but from the weight of all the stares pressing on him. For a long moment, no one spoke. The class was stunned. Some students glanced at each other with disbelief. A girl whispered softly, "He solved it," another student muttered, "That's impossible." Mr. Carter walked slowly to the board, adjusting his glasses. He scanned the work line by line, checking for errors. His face shifted from disbelief to shock as he realized the solution was correct, perfectly correct, with every step justified. He turned back to the class, but for once, he had no sarcastic remark to make. Daniel, still standing near the board, looked at the ground. He did not feel pride yet. Instead, he felt exposed, like his secret had been forced out. But deep inside, there was also a flicker of relief. For the first time, he had shown a part of who he truly was. The bell rang suddenly, breaking the silence. Students gathered their things slowly, many still staring at Daniel as they left. Whispers filled the hallways once again, but this time they were different. "Did you see that?" one boy said. "He actually solved it." Another replied, "Maybe he's not what we thought." Daniel returned to his seat quietly, sliding his notebook into his bag. His heart was still racing, but there was a calmness beneath it. Something had changed in that classroom. The mockery that was meant to humiliate him had instead opened a door. As the room emptied, Mr. Carter lingered, still staring at the board. His mind raced with questions. How had Daniel solved such an advanced problem so quickly? Was it luck? Memorization? Or was the boy hiding something greater? For the first time, the teacher was uncertain. Daniel walked out of the room with his usual quiet steps, but the world around him no longer looked the same. He had been pushed into the spotlight, and though he hadn't planned it, he could not go back to being invisible. The next day at Brookside High felt different. Whispers followed Daniel wherever he walked. He could hear pieces of conversations drifting from corners of the hall. Some students were amazed, some were doubtful, and others seemed confused about what they had witnessed in math class. It was like magic, one boy said near the lockers. No way he solved that without help, another replied, though even he sounded unsure. Daniel, however, tried to ignore it all. He kept his eyes low and walked with his usual quiet steps, though inside he felt unsettled. For years, he had lived in the shadows, unnoticed and underestimated. Now, suddenly, everyone was staring at him, not with laughter but with curiosity. It was strange, and part of him didn't know how to handle it. When he entered the math classroom, the atmosphere was thick with expectation. Students turned their heads, some whispering his name. Usually, Daniel sat down without anyone paying attention. This time, his arrival felt like an event. He slipped into his seat, gripping his notebook tightly, wishing the attention would fade. But it didn't. Mr. Carter walked into the room with his usual folder under one arm. He glanced briefly at Daniel, then quickly looked away. His face was unusually serious. The teacher began the lesson as if nothing had happened, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. He wrote equations on the board, explained steps, and asked questions, but his tone was calmer. Some students noticed the change. During the class, a boy from the second row raised his hand and said, "Mr. Carter, what about the problem Daniel solved yesterday? Was it really right?" His question sent a ripple of whispers through the room. Daniel froze in his seat, staring at his desk. He could feel heat rising to his face again. The teacher cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Yes," he said in a controlled tone. It was correct. That simple admission carried weight. Students exchanged glances, realizing their teacher who never praised anyone had confirmed Daniel's solution. For a moment, the boy who had been mocked as a failure was sitting in a pool of respect he had never known before. Daniel's classmates began to see him differently. A girl leaned over from the next row and whispered, "How did you do it?" Another student asked, "Did you memorize the answer?" Daniel simply shook his head, uncomfortable with the attention. He didn't want to brag or explain. To him, solving problems was natural, but explaining it in front of everyone felt impossible. At lunch, Daniel carried his tray to his usual corner table. Normally, he ate alone, unnoticed. But today, two boys from his class sat across from him without asking. "Hey," one of them said, "can you show us how you solved that problem yesterday?" Daniel looked up, surprised. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, another group joined the table. It was strange. Suddenly, everyone wanted to sit with him. He felt uneasy but also a small spark of pride. He had dreamed of moments like this when he was mocked in the hallways. Yet now that it was happening, it felt overwhelming. He didn't know if he wanted all this attention. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter spent the evening thinking about what had happened. The memory of Daniel solving the equation played in his mind. He had always assumed the boy lacked ability. He had treated him as an example of failure, never considering that he might hold real talent. How could he have been so wrong? The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. Was it possible that Daniel was gifted far beyond the level of the class? The following week, Mr. Carter decided to test Daniel again, though not in front of the entire class. After school, he called Daniel to his desk. The classroom was empty, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rows of chairs. Daniel stood nervously, unsure why he had been called. "Daniel," Mr. Carter began, his tone softer than usual, "I want to understand how you think. Yesterday wasn't luck. Show me." He slid a sheet of paper across the desk. On it were several problems, each more complex than the last. Daniel picked up the paper, glanced at the first problem, and began solving. His pencil moved quickly, his mind working with clarity. One by one, he completed the problems, each solution neat and correct. The teacher watched in silence, his surprise growing with every line. When Daniel finished, he placed the paper down and stepped back. Mr. Carter examined the work carefully, checking each step. There were no errors. Not even small ones. For the first time, the teacher looked at Daniel not with sarcasm, but with genuine respect. "You have a gift," Mr. Carter finally said. His voice carried a tone of wonder. "Why haven't you shown this before?" Daniel hesitated. "No one ever asked," he said softly. His eyes lowered, his words simple but heavy with truth. The teacher sat back in his chair, realizing how much he had misunderstood. The boy he had mocked, the student he had dismissed, was far beyond what he had imagined. He felt a pang of guilt for his treatment of him in the past. The next day, Mr. Carter's attitude toward Daniel shifted. He no longer used him as a target for mockery. Instead, he began to challenge him quietly with advanced problems, encouraging him in ways he had never done before. Other students noticed, and whispers spread again, but this time they were filled with admiration. For Daniel, it was both a relief and a challenge. He had hidden his abilities for so long that showing them now felt strange. But each problem he solved in front of Mr. Carter gave him confidence. Each equation was a reminder that he was not what others believed. He was more. Soon, word spread beyond the classroom. Other teachers began hearing about the incident. A science teacher asked Daniel a question during class, and to everyone's surprise, he answered with precision and depth. The librarian noticed his stack of advanced books and mentioned it to the principal. Slowly, the image of Daniel as the held-back student began to fade. In its place, a new image was forming, that of a hidden genius. But not everyone was quick to accept it. Some students still whispered doubts. "Maybe he cheated," one boy said. "Maybe the teacher gave him the answer." Others argued back, pointing out that Mr. Carter would never do such a thing. The debates filled the cafeteria and hallways, keeping Daniel at the center of attention whether he wanted it or not. Daniel, however, tried to keep living as he always had. He still sat quietly in class, still carried his worn backpack, still walked with soft steps. But deep inside, something had changed. He was no longer afraid of numbers in public. He no longer felt the need to hide his notebooks filled with equations. He had proven himself once, and though it frightened him, he knew he could do it again if needed. The story of the complex equation was no longer just a moment of mockery. It had become the spark of something bigger, something that was only just beginning. The day after Daniel's quiet after-school test with Mr. Carter, a new wave of interest seemed to sweep through Brookside High. Word spread quickly, not just among students but also among teachers. In the teachers' lounge, whispers of the held-back boy who solved the impossible circulated during coffee breaks. Some dismissed it as an exaggeration, but others were curious enough to ask Mr. Carter directly. His serious face and simple response, "It's true," only fueled the talk further. By the time Daniel entered his morning classes, the atmosphere felt different. People looked at him longer than usual. Some smiled politely, some whispered in corners, and others stared as if trying to solve a puzzle themselves. For years, he had been invisible, or worse, someone to mock. Now he was the center of attention. It was overwhelming, and Daniel wasn't sure he liked it. At lunchtime, instead of sitting alone in the corner, he found students pulling out chairs beside him. "Can you help me with my homework?" one asked. Another leaned closer, saying, "Was that equation really as hard as everyone says?" Daniel tried to answer simply, without showing off. "I just saw the steps," he said, shrugging. But to them, his calm answer only deepened the mystery. Later that afternoon, Daniel was summoned to the principal's office. He walked down the long hallway nervously, his palms sweating. The principal, Mrs. Reynolds, was a tall woman with a warm but firm presence. She greeted him kindly and gestured for him to sit. On her desk lay a few sheets of paper, copies of the problems Mr. Carter had given him. "Daniel," she began softly, "your teacher tells me you have a remarkable talent. I'd like to understand more." Her voice held none of the sharpness Daniel was used to. It was filled with curiosity and respect. Daniel nodded, unsure what to say. Mrs. Reynolds continued, "We sometimes test students who show unusual ability, to see how best we can support them. Would you be willing to take a short assessment?" Daniel hesitated but agreed. The principal handed him a set of advanced math problems, the kind used in state competitions. Daniel bent over the paper, his pencil moving steadily. Minutes passed, then an hour. When he finished, Mrs. Reynolds looked at his answers, her eyebrows rising higher with each line she checked. She leaned back in her chair, astonished. "Daniel," she said finally, "these are not the results of an ordinary student. You have a gift that must be nurtured. We cannot let it go unseen any longer." Daniel shifted uneasily. He was not used to praise, not used to being treated as special. For so long, his life had been about blending in, avoiding attention. Now, the opposite was happening. It scared him, but somewhere deep inside, it also warmed him. That evening, the principal called his mother, who worked long hours to support the family. She was surprised, even doubtful at first, but when she heard the seriousness in Mrs. Reynolds' tone, tears filled her eyes. For years, she had seen her son spending hours with notebooks and books, lost in numbers, but she thought it was only a hobby. Now she realized it was something much greater. Within days, the school arranged for specialists to evaluate Daniel's abilities. Psychologists and academic advisors came in, giving him various tasks, puzzles, logical reasoning, memory tests, and problem-solving far beyond high school level. Daniel approached each one calmly, solving them faster than they expected. The results were clear, his IQ was at a genius level. This revelation changed everything. Suddenly, Daniel was no longer just the held-back student. He became the genius of Brookside High. Teachers began approaching him with curiosity rather than dismissal. Students, once cruel in their laughter, now looked at him with respect, even envy. But this new world wasn't without challenges. Some students struggled to accept the change. A few whispered bitterly, "He got lucky," or "It's just a phase." Others avoided him entirely, unsure how to treat someone who was suddenly viewed as extraordinary. For Daniel, this mix of admiration and doubt was confusing. He had long dreamed of respect, but now that he had it, he wasn't sure it brought happiness. One afternoon, the school organized a small assembly. A handful of students were asked to present projects or talents. To Daniel's surprise, he was invited to demonstrate his skills. He stood on the stage, facing rows of classmates, his heart racing. Mr. Carter introduced him in a respectful tone, something Daniel had never heard before. "This young man," he said, "has shown us the importance of looking beyond assumptions. Please give your attention to Daniel." The room was quiet as Daniel approached the board on stage. A large equation had been prepared, another challenge that most students would not even attempt. At first, Daniel hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. But then he remembered all the evenings at his kitchen table, all the hours he had spent solving problems for the pure love of it. He picked up the marker, and soon the numbers began to flow. Step by step, line by line, he filled the board. The silence deepened. Students leaned forward, following his every move. Teachers exchanged glances, nodding slowly in recognition of his skill. Within minutes, Daniel reached the final solution and placed the marker down. He turned around shyly, not knowing what to expect. Then, the room erupted in applause. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt what it was like to be celebrated instead of ridiculed. His chest swelled with a feeling he had never known before: confidence. Mr. Carter clapped too, though more slowly. His eyes met Daniel's, and for a brief moment, there was something like apology in them. He had been wrong about the boy, and he knew it. The days that followed brought new opportunities. The school arranged for Daniel to join advanced programs, connecting him with mentors from universities. Scholarships were mentioned, competitions discussed. The future that once seemed narrow now looked wide open. At home, Daniel's mother hugged him tightly one evening, whispering through tears, "I always knew you were special." For the first time, Daniel believed it himself. Still, he remained humble. He continued sitting quietly in the back of classrooms, carrying his worn backpack, and solving problems in his notebooks. But he carried himself a little taller, with a spark in his eyes. He no longer saw himself as invisible. The turning point had arrived, and life would never be the same again. Weeks passed at Brookside High, but the memory of Daniel solving that impossible equation never faded. Instead, it grew into a story told in classrooms, whispered in hallways, and repeated even outside the school. Parents mentioned it at dinner tables, teachers used it as an example in their lessons, and students carried it like a legend. Daniel, the boy once mocked for being held back, was now recognized as the hidden genius no one had seen coming. For Daniel, life had changed in many ways, yet some things remained the same. He still walked with quiet steps, still carried his old backpack, still kept his notebooks close. But inside, he was different. The shy boy who had once feared being noticed now carried a new kind of strength. His confidence grew, not in a loud way, but in the steady knowledge that he had something valuable within him. The greatest change came in how people treated him. Students who once laughed now greeted him with respect. Some asked for help with homework, and others simply wanted to talk to him, hoping a bit of his brilliance might rub off on them. Even teachers began to look at him with new eyes. They no longer saw a student struggling at the back of the room, but a young mind far beyond his years. One morning, Daniel entered math class to find a strange quietness. The students were already seated, their eyes darting between him and the front of the room. On the board, written in bold letters, were the words, "Math Competition Qualifiers." Mr. Carter stood by the board, holding a stack of papers. "As some of you may know," he began, "our school has been invited to send students to the regional math competition this year. It's a tough challenge, but it's also an opportunity to represent Brookside at a higher level." He paused, his eyes scanning the room before resting on Daniel. "I've already spoken with the principal. Daniel will be one of our representatives." The class buzzed with whispers. Some students nodded approvingly, while others looked surprised. Daniel's heart raced. A competition? He had solved problems alone, in the quiet of his room, but standing against others, in front of judges? It frightened him. Yet he also felt a flicker of excitement. This was a chance to prove himself, not just to his school, but to the wider world. The weeks leading up to the competition were filled with preparation. Daniel spent hours after school with Mr. Carter, who had now become more of a mentor than a critic. Together, they worked through practice problems, some so complex they filled entire pages. For the first time, Daniel saw another side of his teacher: encouraging, patient, and genuinely invested in his success. "You see, Daniel," Mr. Carter said one evening, as the classroom lights flickered, "genius is not just about solving equations. It's about courage, showing your mind to the world even when it scares you. You've already done that once. Now you must do it again. Daniel nodded silently, understanding the truth in those words. When the day of the competition arrived, Daniel's mother accompanied him to the venue. She held his hand tightly as they walked through the large doors of the city auditorium. The room buzzed with energy, filled with students from different schools, all wearing neat uniforms, their faces sharp with determination. Judges sat at long tables, papers stacked in front of them. Daniel's heart pounded as he took his seat among the competitors. For a moment, the noise, the crowd, and the bright lights threatened to overwhelm him. But then he thought of all the evenings at home, the endless notebooks, the quiet joy he felt whenever he solved a problem. Numbers had never betrayed him. Equations had always been his friends. Slowly, calmness returned. The competition began. Problems were read aloud, displayed on screens, and handed out on sheets. Some students frowned, others whispered nervously to themselves. Daniel bent over his paper, his pencil flying across the page. The problems were complex, but to him they unfolded like familiar stories. He moved from one to the next, steady and focused, while the world around him faded away. Hours passed, and finally the judges called time. Papers were collected, and the students waited anxiously as results were checked. Daniel sat quietly, his hands folded on his lap. He did not dare to hope too much, but deep inside, he felt he had done well. When the judges returned, the auditorium grew silent. The head judge, an older man with kind eyes, stepped up to the microphone. "This year's top scorer," he announced, pausing for effect, "comes from Brookside High School, Daniel." The room erupted in applause. Students clapped, teachers cheered, and Daniel's mother covered her mouth in shock, tears streaming down her face. Daniel himself sat frozen for a moment, unable to believe what he had heard. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet and walked to the stage. As he accepted the certificate and medal, flashes from cameras lit the room. For the first time in his life, he stood in front of a crowd not as someone to mock, but as someone to celebrate. He bowed his head slightly, a shy smile spreading across his face. Back at Brookside, the news of his victory spread like wildfire. He was no longer just a student who surprised his class, he was now the boy who brought pride to the entire school. Teachers congratulated him in hallways, students clapped when he entered the cafeteria, and even those who once doubted him admitted they had been wrong. Mr. Carter, too, changed in ways Daniel never expected. He no longer carried the cold sarcasm that once defined him. Instead, he spoke to Daniel with respect and even shared stories of his own struggles as a young student. One afternoon, he told Daniel, "I mocked you once, and I regret it deeply. But you have taught me something, that greatness can hide where we least expect it." Daniel nodded, not with anger but with quiet forgiveness. He understood now that sometimes people judge what they don't understand. And sometimes, even teachers needed to learn lessons. At home, life grew brighter. His mother no longer worried only about survival. She dreamed aloud about universities, scholarships, and futures filled with possibilities. Daniel listened quietly, but this time he believed her dreams were real. He was no longer invisible. His path, once uncertain, now stretched wide and clear. Months later, when he sat once more at his small kitchen table, notebook open and pencil in hand, Daniel smiled. The world outside now saw him as a genius, but for him, the joy remained the same, the thrill of solving problems, the peace of numbers flowing across the page. The boy who was once mocked, underestimated, and ignored had shown the world his true self. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that greatness often hides in silence, waiting for the right moment to be revealed.